Imagine North America, tens of thousands of years ago. Ice Age glaciers, woolly mammoths, and small bands of humans on the move. How did the first people get here? The prevailing theory is that ancient hunters from Asia followed herds across Beringia, a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska during the Ice Age. This could have happened as early as 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, long before recorded history. In fact, recent discoveries have literally cemented this early timeline. Fossilized human footprints in New Mexico's White Sands date to about 23,000 years ago, suggesting people roamed the American Southwest while mammoths and giant sloths still wandered the land. Over millennia, those first pioneers spread out across the continent and adapted to countless environments, from arid deserts to lush forests. They weren't a single group for long. They diversified into hundreds of distinct peoples and tribes, each with their own languages, cultures, and ways of life. By 10,000 BCE, humans were well established throughout North America, living off the land by hunting, foraging, and eventually farming. Agriculture took root. By around 3000 BCE, early farmers in present-day Arizona and New Mexico were growing corn and using irrigation canals to water their crops. Over time, Native American societies became more complex, giving rise to rich cultures and even cities. Monk's Mound in Cahokia, modern Illinois, the largest earthwork of the Mississippian city that thrived around AD 1100. One amazing example of a pre-Columbian city is Cahokia, near modern St. Louis. Around the 11th–12th century CE, Cahokia was a bustling urban center. It covered miles of territory and built over 100 enormous earthen mounds as platforms for temples and homes. Its population may have reached 10 to 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the time. Cahokia was part of the Mississippian culture, which was known for large-scale agriculture, growing maize or corn, trade networks across the continent, and complex social structures with chiefs and even human sacrifices in their rituals. And Cahokia wasn't alone. In the Southwest, the ancestral Pueblanos, or Anasazi, were building multi-story stone dwellings in cliffsides by 900 CE, and in the Northeast, the Iroquois formed a powerful confederacy of tribes by the 1400s. In short, long before any Europeans showed up, the land was already home to millions of people and vibrant civilizations.
Fast forward to the late 15th century. European explorers discover the Americas, a meeting of worlds that would change history forever. In 1492, Columbus reached the Caribbean, and soon Spain, France, England, and others were sending ships across the ocean. For the Native Americans, these encounters were devastating. European colonization brought new diseases and conflicts that decimated indigenous populations. Still, new societies emerged from this collision. Spain established outposts in Florida and the Southwest, France in the Mississippi Valley and Canada, and the English founded colonies along the East Coast. The first lasting English settlement was Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, started by adventurers looking for wealth. Not long after, in 1620, a group of English pilgrims seeking religious freedom landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts. You might recall the Thanksgiving story, with Native Americans helping the pilgrims survive their first winter. Over the 1600s and early 1700s, 13 British colonies took root along the Atlantic coast. Each had its own economy and character, from New England townships to southern plantations. Sadly, many southern colonies relied on slave labor, bringing millions of enslaved Africans to America against their will. It's a dark part of history. By the 1700s, enslaved people were the backbone of labor in the South, working on tobacco, rice, and cotton plantations. Life in the colonies wasn't all hardship. There were thriving port cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and a spirit of opportunity attracted immigrants from across Europe. But the colonies existed under British rule, and by the 1760s, tensions were rising between colonists and the British Crown. Britain's victory in the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, left it in debt, so it tried to tax the colonies. Remember the no taxation without representation outcry? Events escalated, from the Boston Tea Party protest to British crackdowns, until war broke out.
In April 1775, colonial militias clashed with British troops at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, the first shots of the American Revolution. The colonies had formally entered a war for independence. A year later, on July 4, 1776, colonial leaders adopted the Declaration of Independence, asserting that all men are created equal and announcing a new nation, the United States of America. It was a bold claim that would take years of fighting to realize. The Revolutionary War raged from 1775 to 1783. Under the leadership of General George Washington, the scrappy Continental Army, with some help from France, managed to defeat the mighty British Empire. The victory was sealed with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, in which Britain recognized American independence. Now came the challenge of building a country from scratch. The former colonies, now states, first tried a loose alliance under the Articles of Confederation, but that proved too weak. So in 1787, representatives met again and drafted the U.S. Constitution, creating the framework of a federal republic. This constitution, ratified in 1788, established the government still used today and is actually the world's oldest written national constitution in continuous use. George Washington was elected the first president under this new system, taking office in 1789. A Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments guaranteeing individual liberties like freedom of speech and religion, was added by 1791. The young United States was a small nation of just a few million people hugging the East Coast, but had big ambitions and a pioneer spirit. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the country's size in one stroke by purchasing the vast Louisiana Territory from France, over 800,000 square miles of land from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This Louisiana purchase opened the door for Americans to push westward. Explorers like Lewis and Clark trekked to the Pacific, and settlers, farmers, and adventurers followed in wagon trains. The idea of manifest destiny took hold, a belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. By the 1840s, the U.S. had annexed Texas, fought a war with Mexico 1846–48, and gained what is now the American Southwest, including California.
As the United States grew in size and population, it also grew more divided in the mid-1800s. The biggest dividing line was slavery. Would new Western territories be free states or slave states? This issue of slavery's expansion caused fierce national debate and conflict. Tensions peaked with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Southern states feared Lincoln would abolish slavery entirely, so 11 Southern states seceded, broke away from the Union, and formed the Confederate States of America. The dispute erupted into the American Civil War in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. This was by far the bloodiest war in U.S. history, as North and South battled for 4 long years. The Civil War's turning point came in 1863 when Union Northern victory at Gettysburg halted the Southern advance. In 1865, the Union, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, finally forced the Confederate surrender. The war preserved the United States as one nation and led to the abolition of slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the 13th Amendment in 1865 freed all enslaved people. But the country paid a terrible price, over 600,000 lives lost and many cities in ruins. After the war came Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, an effort to rebuild the South and extend rights to newly freed African Americans. For a time, the federal government enforced civil rights in the South, but this progress was met with resistance. By the late 1870s, old Southern elites regained power and imposed segregation, the Jim Crow era, rolling back many of the gains for Black Americans. This is a painful chapter, but also one that sowed the seeds for future civil rights movements. Meanwhile, the late 19th century also saw the rise of American industry and innovation. This period, often called the Gilded Age, transformed the U.S. into an economic powerhouse. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, connecting coasts in a week instead of months. Oil, steel, and electricity industries boomed thanks to inventors and entrepreneurs. Think of names like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell. Millions of immigrants poured in from Europe and Asia, providing labor and diversifying the young nation. By 1900, the United States had the largest industrial output in the world, a stunning rise from frontier colonies to factory superpower. Not everything was rosy. There were crowded tenements and tough labor conditions, but reformers soon pushed to address these issues. The progressive era in the early 20th century brought changes like safer workplaces, food and drug safety laws, women's suffrage, the right of women to vote achieved in 1920, and more accountable government.
In the 20th century, the U.S. truly stepped onto the global stage. When World War I broke out in 1914, America initially stayed neutral. But in 1917, after repeated provocations, the U.S. declared war on Germany and tipped the balance in favor of the Allies' victory in WW1. President Woodrow Wilson hoped WW1 would be the war to end all wars, and the U.S. emerged from the conflict as a major world power, though it retreated into isolation in the 1920s. The 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, were a time of economic boom and cultural flourish in America. Jazz music, flapper fashion, and the rise of radio. But the party ended with the stock market crash of 1929, which triggered the Great Depression. In the 1930s, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed as banks and businesses failed. President Franklin Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a series of government programs to create jobs and support those in need. Slowly, the economy started to recover, but full recovery really came with the massive industrial effort of World War II. World War II, 1939 to 1945, was even more significant for the United States. The U.S. tried to stay out at first, but when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, the country was thrust into war. Americans fought on 2 major fronts, Europe and the Pacific. Alongside Allied forces, the U.S. helped defeat Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in Europe, while in the Pacific, U.S. troops battled island by island toward Japan. The war effort invigorated American industry, ending the Depression, and saw huge social changes at home as women worked in factories, Rosie the Riveter became an icon, and African Americans campaigned for double victory, freedom abroad and at home. The war ended in 1945 after the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. The use of nuclear weapons shocked the world and ushered in a new complex era. When the dust settled, America was one of 2 global superpowers, the other being the Soviet Union. The U.S. had taken a leading role in founding the United Nations and shaping the post-war world. Prosperity at home surged in the late 1940s and 1950s as a baby boom, suburban growth, and the rise of consumer culture defined the era, as well as the beginning of the civil rights movement for racial equality.
No sooner had World War II ended than the Cold War began. This was an ideological and geopolitical struggle between the United States, capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, communist dictatorship, lasting roughly from 1947 to 1991. The 2 superpowers never fought directly, but they engaged in an arms race, building bigger and more nuclear weapons, and a space race, competed for influence around the world, and faced off in proxy wars like Korea in the 1950s and Vietnam in the 1960s. It was a time of high tensions. School children drilled on what to do in a nuclear attack, and phrases like Iron Curtain and Red Scare entered the lexicon. Yet it was also a time of incredible technological progress and social change in America. One of the proudest moments in U.S. history came in the midst of the Cold War. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy vowed to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. The nation poured energy and resources into NASA's Apollo space program. And on July 20, 1969, it happened. Apollo 11 succeeded, and astronaut Neil Armstrong took one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind by stepping onto the moon's surface. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin,
photographed by Neil Armstrong, stands on the moon in 1969 during Apollo 11, a pinnacle of American technological achievement. Millions watched on TV as the U.S. won the space race, fulfilling a dream as old as humanity. The moon landing symbolized how far the country had come, from frontier settlers in covered wagons to rocket ships reaching beyond Earth. Back on Earth, the 1960s were turbulent but transformative. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., achieved major victories against racial segregation and discrimination. Laws in the mid-1960s outlawed segregation and protected voting rights, at last enforcing African Americans equal rights under the Constitution. The era also saw second-wave feminism, expanding women's rights and opportunities, youth counterculture, and protests against the Vietnam War. By 1975, the unpopular Vietnam War ended, and a few years later, the Cold War itself began to wind down. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, marking the end of the Cold War and leaving the United States as the sole superpower on the world stage. As the 20th century closed, Americans experienced an economic boom in the 80s and 90s, the rise of personal computers and the Internet, which started as a U.S. defense research project and grew into the World Wide Web connecting everyday people. American pop culture, Hollywood films, rock and roll, later hip-hop and more, spread globally, making the U.S. as much a cultural superpower as a military or economic one. In the 21st century, the U.S. has faced new challenges and changes. The September 11, 2001 terror attacks were a defining moment leading to new security measures and conflicts abroad, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The 2008 financial crisis tested the economy, but the nation rebounded. Socially, the country has become ever more diverse. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected as the first African-American president in U.S. history, reflecting decades of progress. Technology continues to transform daily life, from smartphones to social media, much of it driven by American innovation. Yet, the fundamental narrative remains one of an ongoing quest to live up to the ideals of freedom, equality, and opportunity.